Claudia Marasco, and I'm a resident here in the village of Lewiston, and I've lived here for a longer period of time than I actually lived in Minnesota. I was born in Duluth, and most of my childhood revolved around Lake Superior and the fact that my father worked on an area called the Arrowhead Bridge, and he had been involved in an accident where the coal dock bridge was actually connected. He was the crane operator, and the guy next to him fell to his death. My dad luckily survived. That's why I'm still here. So I lived along Lake Superior in Duluth for the first 10 years, and that's where I really was introduced to the aerial bridge, which is the connecting piece. We know that the Great Lakes itself has its history starts with Duluth, Minnesota, and that is the city where everything else involved in the Great Lakes comes from. So my uncle was a captain. He had 3 ships himself, and out of Duluth, Superior, the 2 sister cities, and then the boats would come in and out of the channel there. And part of the beach was actually sandy, and the other part was complete rocky situation. So a lot of people would go down to what was called Park Point, which is where the aerial bridge is. It's a lift bridge. You go up and down. You had to wait your turn if you were passing over some railroad cars or whatever. And then you could actually see Lake Superior, and you could watch the ships. That's what we did. We watched them come in and come out of the harbor, and it was something that we went to usually most nights of the week. When my dad would come home from work, my mom always wanted to get out of the house. So she said, let's go to Park Point. And their friends owned the actual little ice cream place and the burger place down there. So they'd be chatting with them, and of course I was kind of scooting around looking at everything else, and would get my hand stuck in the telephone booth or do something crazy while I was down there. But we loved going there. And because my uncle was very involved with the Great Lakes, then my father had the opportunity to move and take another position, which would be outside Duluth, another hour and a half up what was called the Arrowhead, which is Highway 61, one of the most beautiful routes in the United States of America, that if you've never been to, you need to make a point of going up there. So we moved, and my dad wound up working in a place called Taconite Harbor, which obviously refers to the taconite, the small pellets that are made of the remains of the digging for the iron ore, the trailings they would call it, that were melted in together, and then it made a little ball about the size of a marble. So those were the pellets, and that's what was loaded in and off the ships throughout the Great Lakes to bring them to other communities, and of course then made into steel. So I also had an uncle that had a steel plant ownership, and so it's all kind of intermeshed with all of them, but it all revolves basically about Duluth. So we lived in what was called Taconite Harbor, which is a very remote area, and there were homes that were built for the workers that were coming. My father worked the Welland crane, which would help load and unload. A lot of times it would be coal or the pellets itself that were brought by the railroads or ships, and it was just this hub of activity. So we were always allowed to go on the boats, and my dad wanted to take us. We could go, and we never thought anything of the fact that that wouldn't be something that, of course, any visitors would be dragged along as well. And my dad was very proud to show the boats. So I can remember going as a really young girl, even in Duluth, and then again up at Taconite Harbor. And one of the boats that I saw, and I believe it was at Taconite Harbor, or again in Superior, Wisconsin, when my uncle would have taken me, was the Edmund Fitzgerald. It also passed our house many times. I could look at Lake Superior from my kitchen. My mother had a pair of binoculars on the window, so she charted the boats and knew what was coming and going. Good weather, bad weather, whatever was happening. but the Edmund Fitzgerald was one that you knew when you saw it. It was majestic. It was bigger than all the rest. I can remember the white part where the pilot was in the top section, the white section, and then of course the beautiful maroon bottom, and always said Edmund Fitzgerald. And I always thought, gee, usually they have a middle initial, but this one doesn't seem to. Maybe she doesn't need it. And the other one that I would learn later that was such a big part of her story was the Anderson, which would have been the following ship that was trying to help the Edmund Fitzgerald through the rough patch of the night that the ship went down. So when we lived in Taconite Harbor, my dad would bring us, and usually if the hatch would be open on the boat, then we could look down to see how deep the containers were for what was going to be loaded in and out of the ship. And then we got to actually go into the kitchen area, because I was fascinated with their white mugs. I can remember those white mugs, and I can remember in the kitchen, the cook would show us what he was making for the day, and it probably was fresh fish from out of Lake Superior, which is very well known. Some of the best fishing in the world is there. And I can remember it, and I would say to him, well, why do you have that little wooden piece around everything? And he said, well, guess what happens when it gets a little tough on the water and everything gets going and moving and waves and storms and everything. He said, things slide around. And I said, so that keeps the white cups from breaking? He said, you got it. He said, that keeps the white cups from breaking, and the bowls and the whatever. And so when the ship would come into Taconite Harbor, they had to get groceries. And we just had a very small store. I lived 2 miles away from my mailbox, and we had collected our mail up at what was called Lamb's. And Lamb's owned the only grocery store in the area. And so the cook would go and put in his order, and then that was always brought to the ship to take when they were leaving. So my grandfather worked in the Mesabi Range, which was northern Minnesota, and he worked the open iron ore pits where they took out the really great stuff. And the trucks that were there were the biggest trucks I had ever seen in my life. My grandfather had a very dangerous job. He set the dynamite for the blasting. And you can imagine my grandfather had come from Italy, wanted no part of the underground mines in Virginia. And he said, I will go where this family takes me and members of my community, and we're going to Eveleth, Minnesota. If you've never heard of Eveleth, Minnesota, you're ever on Jeopardy, make sure when they say, and so where is the Hockey Hall of Fame? And you'll say, Toronto. And they'll say, nah, and no one will know the answer, but Eveleth, Minnesota is where the Hockey Hall of Fame in the United States is located. It's a mining town. My father used to play semi-pro hockey as a young man. This is where he learned. And these were some of the best athletes that came out of that small city that actually went to the Olympics. Marinucci is one of them. And Miasech, is one of them. So then after that experience of living at Taconite Harbor, then I went to school at the University of Minnesota, so there I go back to Duluth again. And that's the interaction again with my uncle, other ships, going, coming, seeing whatever. So I know that I have been on the Edmund Fitzgerald, only we would not have ever thought that she would sink. So why would we have thought ahead to make sure you remember this boat, because we'd seen so many. But because of her size and her identification, when you saw her, you knew that this boat was like the Titanic. Never to ever think that this would be the one that would go down. So again, in Duluth, more activity with the boats. And as time progressed then, my uncle had 3 ships of his own that he sailed. He came to Buffalo often, to where the grain elevators are that we're talking about now. He actually had been working with the grain to get to Russia way back in those days, to be able to get that moved out of there and on its way out. and the rest of the family was involved in some way. My first cousin was working on the tugboats to take the boats in and out of the back in Duluth, the aerial bridge area and Superior area, and he did some of that while working for his uncle. Some of the members of the family worked for Bethlehem Steel, Mesabi Range. It all got interconnected, so every place you went in Minnesota, in the north, very cold, the south, the farmland. So I never saw a cow growing up. I didn't know until I didn't even know how they went to the bathroom. The first time I saw one lift a leg, I said, "What? How do they do that?" But anyway, it was fascinating, but a very, very respectful. You take care of the earth. And I think because there were so many Native Americans that lived and we went to school with, we knew that we learned from them, whether it would be the Chippewa or the Ojibwe or whatever the tribe was, that they taught us about the land, to take care of it, not destroy her. We had big logging industry there as well, which was transporting these huge logs that they would go in and out, and of course all that great lumber that came out of northern Minnesota as well. So there was a lot of activity. School was far to go. I had to go to school on a school bus that went 35 miles to school one way, and up trails and down trails and picking up kids, and it was just a very different way of life. And so when I got back to Duluth, I said, "Wow, that was something living up there." But it was a beautiful area, and Duluth is a beautiful city. You need to go see it. If you live anywhere in Duluth, it's so elevated that everybody has a great view. If you live in East Duluth, and that's where you learn to drive. And so I had to have a stick shift car, of course, that's what we all learned on. And those hills, those treacherous hills with the ice and the snow in the winter, you had to learn to do it, and you had to do it well. So it was a great city, and I just, my family has so many connections to the Lake Superior. We were always told never, ever, ever to go in it very far. And in Duluth, you could maybe go to the sandy side. There was a beach there, but the other side, if you went up, it was cold, and the further you went up on Lake Superior, you didn't even put your foot in, and it was too deep and too many tragedies. One of my friends, many of the men made a living through fishing, herring fishing, and one of my friends, her father never came home one night because that's the way things would happen. You would just be out there in the small boat and with your nets and doing your thing and bringing in the herring, which was a beloved fish for eating. And you know, there were tragedies with that way of life as well. And so I guess I saw the Edmund Fitzgerald. I was on the Edmund Fitzgerald, and it amazes me that she didn't make that voyage. But if anybody was going to try to get through that storm, she would. And those hatches were latched, and latched well. It was the railing that came down and the force of everything pounding her repeatedly. That was her demise, and probably some shallow water